Johnny Depp, the ultimate master of transformation, a man who has worn countless lives on screen so that every character is not merely acted but seems torn free from his own flesh, blood, and breath. From the heartbreakingly fragile solitude of Edward Scissorhands to the reckless, delirious, and dangerously brilliant genius of Captain Jack Sparrow in Pirates of the Caribbean, he turned cinema into a living pulse, into haunting memory, into indelible marks carved deep into the minds of audiences. Rising from an unstable beginning where nothing was truly safe, he climbed to the very summit through razor-sharp talent and an untamable rebellious spirit, becoming one of the most mesmerizing, mysterious, and elusive icons Hollywood has ever witnessed. Yet behind those masks, as his private life was swept into a ruthless vortex of shattered marriages and a career in freefall, while the legal battle with his former wife Amber Heard transformed his life into a global stage, where the entire world was forced to watch a man being stripped bare, layer by layer, without mercy, right before their eyes. And today, at 62, Johnny Depp no longer stands as an untouchable symbol. He stands as a man who has walked through fire, carrying invisible burns that time can never erase. So, when admiration fades, what remains strong enough to keep a person standing? If Johnny Depp ever made you believe in the magic of cinema, subscribe to the channel and leave a like now as a tribute. Before we step into the hidden chapters of his life, concealed behind the glare of his fame. Not every rise begins with hope. Some are forged under pressure so tight it conditions a person to endure rather than expect. Johnny Depp, born on June 9, 1963, in the working-class town of Owensboro. He was the youngest of 4 children, raised at a table where tenderness and volatility existed without warning. Nights smelled of cigarette smoke and reheated coffee, a heaviness a child sensed long before he understood it. His father, John Christopher Depp Sr., an engineer worn thin by long hours and fragile pay, came home with oil beneath his nails and a silence that bruised without shouting. His mother, Betty Sue Palmer, a waitress forged by survival and fierce devotion, held the family together on shoulders already bent with exhaustion, dreaming of a calm that rarely arrived. They were never destitute, but always close enough to the edge that a missed paycheck could darken the room. A single argument could make the walls feel unsafe. Childhood passed in motion, more than 20 moves, so constant that nothing fully settled, not furniture, not friendships, not the boy himself. Winters were merciless. Frost crept across the glass while the low hum of an almost empty refrigerator became the soundtrack of endurance. Certain images never left him, his mother counting coins beneath a flickering bulb, hands raw and shaking, his father sitting motionless in dim light, staring into a quiet heavy enough to press on a child's chest. Silence, Johnny would later reflect, was never empty to me. It was crowded. Some evenings the air tightened before voices rose, as if the house itself braced for impact. The children slept pressed together for warmth, listening as whatever held their parents together slowly thinned through walls too fragile to keep secrets. And yet, inside that storm, something endured. At 12, his mother placed a battered guitar into his hands, perhaps from guilt, perhaps from love, and without knowing it, opened a narrow door to survival. Music did not save him, it steadied him. Then came the quiet that tore everything open. In 1978, at 15, the house froze into a stillness that never learns how to move again. One muted morning, the truth surfaced without warning. The stairs led not to conflict, but to omission. Coffee cooling unattended, a chair left open, the room preserved except for the man who had been removed. There was no argument to remember, no goodbye to replay, only absence by design. Years later, he would put it this way: people don't signal when they leave. You only feel the space they carve out of your life. What followed wasn't clarity, but fracture. A mother bending under weight she could no longer redistribute, and 4 siblings left to absorb a disappearance before language could catch up. Betty Sue pushed herself past endurance to keep the lights alive, her laughter receding into something private and brittle, her hands betraying her one tremor at a time. Nearly 2 years later came Robert Palmer, steady, contained, someone he would recall as a real gentleman, the only one who felt solid back then. But the inner shift had already locked in place. From that point on, expectation felt dangerous. Promises felt temporary. Silence felt manageable. "I didn't learn how to hold on," he would later say. "I learned how to remain standing after support gives way." What might have hollowed him instead reshaped him. He stopped searching for safety in places and found it in vibration, in the tremble of guitar strings, in rhythm, in stories that allowed him to rebuild what life kept dismantling. Pain reorganized itself into discipline. Chaos learned structure. Music didn't erase fear, it taught him how to carry it without breaking. Raised inside storms, he learned how to carve beauty from ruins without permission, how to remain visible without vanishing. Years later, carrying the quiet weariness of someone who had felt heat early and never forgotten it, he would come to understand that fire does not merely destroy, it alters what survives it. And perhaps that is the unspoken beginning of Johnny Depp's life. That from frost and fracture came rhythm and restraint, and from a life shaped by absence emerged a language strong enough for other broken hearts to recognize themselves and realize they were never alone in hearing it. Before success was even a question, survival had already become the only measure that mattered. Everything else, music, freedom, even belief, came late. At 16, the decision to leave was not dramatic. It was necessary. Kentucky had already taught him what staying meant. Repetition, erosion, a slow narrowing of possibility. So in 1979, he stepped away with $35, a worn guitar, and the quiet understanding that nothing ahead was guaranteed. He did not imagine arrival. He prepared for motion. Looking out from a dust-clouded window as the sun climbed behind him, he felt no triumph, only the dull certainty that the past could no longer hold him without breaking him entirely. What followed was not adventure, but exposure. Days lost their names. Nights became places where sound replaced shelter. In Florida, de-borrowed garages stood in for homes, thick with heat, sweat, and the smell of beer that never quite left the walls. With his childhood friend Bruce Whitkin, he built a band not out of confidence, but necessity. They called it The Kids, and played wherever tolerance passed for opportunity. Bars that barely listened, parking lots that didn't care, county fairs already packing up. Payment was thin. Sometimes it wasn't money at all. There were nights, he would later say, when hope was the only currency we had left. And even that felt unstable, like spending tomorrow before it arrived. Hunger has a way of clarifying things. It strips pride down to bone. To keep music breathing, he accepted whatever work delayed collapse. Painting, houses, under a sun that punished mistakes. Selling pens to strangers who laughed and hung up. They carrying broken speakers up staircases that smelled of disappointment. Rejection didn't announce itself anymore. It became background noise. Once, after hours of playing, a man handed him $10 and told him that was all he was worth. He smiled, thanked him. Later, alone, the words stayed. They always did. Some nights, there was no room to fail in, only a car. windows fogged with breath, a guitar case pulled close, less for warmth than for familiarity. Pride kept his mouth shut. Music kept his pulse steady. Fingers split against steel strings, and the pain mattered because it confirmed something essential. He was still present, still resisting disappearance. By 20, the sound he'd been chasing led west. Los Angeles didn't offer answers. It demanded proof. Money vanished faster than chances. Rooms filled and emptied without memory. Then he played to half-awake crowds while neon signs flickered outside like witnesses who refused to testify. Admiration and loneliness learned how to share the same sidewalk. We thought we'd found paradise, he would later reflect, but paradise didn't notice us. When the band fractured, what remained was debt, hunger, and a face no one remembered. Help arrived without ceremony. His wife at the time, Lori Ann Allison, introduced him to Nicolas Cage, who looked past the exhaustion and saw something unresolved. "You've got something raw," Cage told him. "You should try acting." It sounded ridiculous. No training, no plan, no margin for failure. But when nothing is stable, even an unfamiliar door feels worth touching. In 1984, he stood under unfamiliar lights auditioning for A Nightmare on Elm Street, in wearing a borrowed shirt that still smelled faintly of smoke. He expected another no. Instead, Wes Craven's daughter leaned over and whispered, "He looks kind." That single observation changed the direction of everything, not because it promised success, but because it acknowledged presence. For the first time, the world did not look past him. The role was small. The pay was modest. But standing there, heat pressing down, he understood something irreversible. Acting was not escape. It was translation. A way to give shape to everything he had carried without ever being asked. "I never planned on being an actor," he would later say, "but it became the place where my life could finally speak." He did not rise toward fame. He rose toward continuity, toward staying. And in that slow, stubborn endurance, like a quiet truth took hold. When a life is forged under pressure, even recognition has weight. And sometimes the most radical act is not becoming famous, but remaining alive long enough for your story to matter. Success did not burst upon him like fireworks. It crept in like a patient, relentless tide, lifting his body upward while quietly erasing the ground beneath his feet. In 1984, at 21, Johnny Depp walked onto the set of A Nightmare on Elm Street, not with the serenity of a rival, but with the frantic pulse of a man who had just escaped the ache of sleeping in cars, the stale air of bars that swallowed dreams, and the cold loneliness of nights where silence felt like a sentence. The studio lights pressed down with surgical intensity, part benediction, part threat. The clapperboard cracked with clinical precision, and the camera leaned so close that he could almost taste his own breath returning to him like a ghost. On paper, the role was minor. In his chest, it felt like a door slamming shut behind him, sealing a life he could never step back into. Hollywood did not roar. It watched, unblinking, and in that stillness, he sensed a brutal truth. This world would feed him, but it would keep the receipt. By 1987, 21 Jump Street transformed his face into an image that others claimed without permission, taped to bedroom walls, reproduced in glossy magazines, lifted away from the flesh and blood man beneath. He performed flawlessly before the lens, yet internally his identity thinned, stretched, almost translucent, as if every moment of fame quietly siphoned something irreplaceable from him. Years later, he reflected, I was visible everywhere, yet emotionally homeless, seen by millions, but known by no one. The turning point did not arrive as triumph. It arrived like a wound, recognizing its own shape. In 1990, an Edward Scissorhands came to him like a mirror edged with blades, where tenderness and trauma bled into one another. Through Edward, he exposed memories of a childhood in which intimacy felt like glass, beautiful but terrifyingly breakable. And Tim Burton seemed to perceive the hidden, feral, aching creatures inside him that he had buried out of survival. From Ed Wood to Benny and June to Sleepy Hollow, he stopped chasing approval and began chasing truth, letting each character carry a fragment of his past that still throbbed beneath the skin. In 2003, Pirates of the Caribbean dragged him into a global maelstrom, where Jack Sparrow became both lifeline and gilded cage. Studios hesitated, doubted, recoiled, and still he trusted his instinct, a gamble that yielded over $650 million and an Oscar nomination. Yet behind the smeared coal and the wavering grin lay 130-day shoots, sleep reduced to a rumor, and a border between man and mask that dissolved night after night. He later admitted, "Jack reached into my darkness and pulled me out. But in doing so, he built a spotlight around me I could no longer escape." The summit revealed itself not as a launch pad, but as an altitude where oxygen grows cruelly thin. In 2010, Alice in Wonderland crossed the $1 billion threshold, placing him among the rare stars commanding over $55 million for a single film. To the world, it looked like victory. Inside him, it felt like anesthesia, applause drifting toward him from an impossible distance. In identical hotel rooms scattered across time zones, he stared into mirrors that reflected not a titan of cinema, but the Kentucky boy straining to hear the echo of a distant guitar. When the Lone Ranger collapsed in 2013 with nearly $200 million in losses, he did not rage, justify, or perform. He absorbed the silence and accepted it as proof of his mortality. Between blinding lights and creative depletion, a razor-edged question cut through him. Could the child who once fled with $35 and a battered guitar still be found beneath the armor of adoration? And as the lights reached their fiercest blaze, a long, patient shadow advanced, not violent, not loud, but heavy enough to test every illusion he had ever built, while leaving only one thing untouchable: the fragile, stubborn truth of who he was. Success doesn't announce itself with impact. Tea corrodes. It eats into a life slowly enough that you keep standing, until the day you realize your spine has been carrying a weight it was never built to survive. By the early 2000s, Johnny Depp was no longer moving toward success. He was sealed inside it. Hollywood didn't assess him anymore. It depended on him. Alice in Wonderland crossed the $1 billion mark. His fee crept toward $55 million a film. Distance dissolved. Residences multiplied until home became a logistical term, not a feeling. Jets turned borders into abstractions. A yacht cut precise lines through open water as if permanence could be charted and repeated. Art and guitars filled rooms designed to look enduring. From the outside, it read as command. Inside, something human was thinning. The instinct that once chose sound over safety now answered schedules, projections, approvals. Creation narrowed into maintenance. Applause stayed loud, but it lost its direction. "There's a point," he later said softly, "when the noise keeps arriving, but it never quite lands. You're there, but you're not inside yourself anymore." The higher he climbed, the less breathable his world became. Estimates placed his worth near $650 million. But abundance doesn't elevate. It compresses. It reduces margin. Trust began to move faster than awareness. I assumed things would hold, he reflected later. People, systems, the whole setup. Money stopped pushing back. More than $2 million drained away each month to keep a life in motion that required constant proof of itself. Estates across Los Angeles, a 37-acre village in France, a private island in the Bahamas, the 156-foot yacht Vajoliroja, his family's name drifting across water like a promise that couldn't feel time. 40 employees, jets leased at $200,000 a month, $30,000 on wine. Not celebration but anesthesia, not enjoyment but suspension. Buying became a way to keep stillness at a distance, because stillness asked questions he wasn't ready to answer. There were nights when the distant hum of a departing jet bled through the windows, his own breath faintly fogging the glass as if even the air hesitated around him. There were nights when he stood alone in rooms too large to feel inhabited, instruments hanging untouched, rain pressing against the windows, and sensed the quiet panic of owning everything while feeling unanchored. I thought surrounding myself would keep me intact, he later admitted. What it really did was scatter me. The collapse didn't arrive with spectacle. It arrived with exposure. In 2017, his longtime managers at the management group claimed the unraveling was self-inflicted. He answered with accusations of fraud, negligence, betrayal. Court filings did what fame never had. They removed the romance. Numbers replaced narrative. Hundreds of millions gone. Income unable to outrun erosion. A life consuming itself faster than it could be rebuilt. Privately, he later suggested, it felt less like a legal battle and more like the floor tilting beneath his feet. The lens shifted. Faces disappeared. Balance sheets took their place. The actor who once disappeared into characters now stood unshielded, without role or costume. Projects faltered. And the Lone Ranger bled nearly $200 million. Mordecai passed without echo. Studio conversations shortened, then stopped altogether. Applause, he noted later, has a way of vanishing when momentum turns. There was no anger in it, only recognition. By the late 2000s, the dismantling became methodical. Properties sold, art cataloged and auctioned, objects once believed permanent reduced to line items. Even the yacht slipped away. At one point, harbor lights blinked in a slow, indifferent rhythm as it moved into the dark, as if the water itself were gently erasing its outline. And yet, something refused to collapse. Without insulation, without spectacle, he didn't disappear. He recalibrated. Sometimes, he reflected quietly, on everything has to come apart before you can see what you were never meant to carry. Perhaps that is the unspoken truth beneath Johnny Depp's arc. Admiration can build an empire, but it cannot teach a person how to stand once it's gone. What remains isn't protection or elevation. It's presence. And sometimes, presence is the heaviest thing a person has to survive. There are moments when the spotlight does not simply fade, but withdraws from the soul itself. Not because the world stopped watching, but because the spirit could no longer perform. His fiercest battles were never on stages or in headlines, but in narrow corridors of silence where every echo felt like judgment. Love never arrived as shelter. It crashed in like a midnight collision, blinding, magnetic, merciless. His relationships did not unfold, they ignited, dazzling for a breath, then fracturing under their own pressure. He loved at the velocity of his life, too fast, too open, too total, before he learned how violently things can shatter. When love ended, it did not fade. It lingered like a burn etched into glass, trapped in unfinished sentences and empty hotel rooms. Looking back, then he knew he had always been grasping for something unnamed, a stillness forever out of reach, and that hunger steered every choice he made. I wasn't running from the noise. I was hunting a quiet that never existed, he later admitted. To the outside world, it looked like passion. But beneath it was a man reaching for connection while already bracing for its loss, performing his most devastating role far from the spotlight, exposed, trembling, yet still refusing to close his heart. And to understand that fracture, one has to travel backward, to a time before the cameras, before the noise, before the world claimed him. There, at the very beginning, light had once filled the room. That fracture existed before fame ever touched him. Yet, in its beginning, there had been a dazzling season of light. In 1983, at only 20, he married Lori Ann Allison, a makeup artist whose calm felt like gravity in a life drifting toward chaos. In those early years, their world seemed small, warm, and electric. Late-night kitchen lights, cheap coffee growing cold beside ashtrays, laughter spilling down dim stairwells, two young people believing the future would bend gently toward them. While his musical ambitions were unraveling and his future felt uncertain, she gave him what dreams could not. Something solid to lean against, a hand that did not tremble when his did. She believed in him before recognition arrived, before cameras turned every gesture into spectacle, before success quietly began to tax his spirit. Through her came a quiet pivot, a single moment of guidance that subtly but permanently redirected his path, like a hand on his back at a crossroads. In memory, Lori would later say, "Back then, I didn't think I was saving him. I just thought I was standing beside him. Yet even as doors opened, instability seeped in. Sleepless nights stretched longer, smoke hung heavier in the air, conversations thinned into half-finished sentences, and two people who once breathed in rhythm slowly fell out of time." By 1985, the marriage dissolved without drama, without accusation, without public fracture. Only the sober truth that what once anchored him could no longer carry them both. The separation was silent, almost polite, but its aftershock stayed with him like a tremor beneath the surface of his life. He would later remember, "I didn't lose her to chaos. I lost her to the slow cost of becoming who I was meant to be." While Lori, years later, would reflect, "We didn't fall apart in a single moment. We faded, like a photograph left too long in the sun." Looking back, he would not call that marriage a failure, but a crossing, a threshold between the man he was and the man he would become. He came to understand that some people are not meant to stay forever. They arrive to open a door you must eventually walk through alone. Though Lori left early, her presence never fully disappeared, lingering like a quiet melody beneath everything that followed. In the way he chose his roles, in the way he loved too fiercely, in the way he carried silence. She did not just share his life, she ignited it, offering belief at the precise moment he needed it most. Before the storms of fame, there had been this fragile season of steadiness, proof that the gentlest love can redirect a destiny. In the vast arc of his life, that marriage was not a footnote, but the first heartbeat, a reminder that the most powerful turning points often come quietly, and that the true cost of a life admired by millions begins not in noise, but in the silence a man must carry for the rest of his days. After the wreck of his first marriage, Johnny Depp carried its aftershock like a bruise everyone pretended not to see, moving through rooms flooded with applause while being haunted by silence, as time kept drawing him toward a moment he did not yet know would shape the rest of his life. Then, in 1998, under the cold lights of the Ninth Gate in Europe, he met Vanessa Paradis. When she looked at him, the noise of his life fell away. Her gaze pierced the polished armor of his fame and found the part of him still trembling, still searching for a place that felt like home. What began as an almost invisible spark deepened into a sanctuary, a private refuge from Hollywood's glare, its temptations, and its silent cruelty. But years later, he would remember it less as rescue than as relief. She didn't pull me from the storm. She became the calm I could breathe inside. With her, he discovered a stability applause could never purchase. They withdrew to the countryside, trading cameras for coffee, cruise for children's laughter, spectacle for solitude. Their love did not thunder. It endured, rooted in privacy, simplicity, and a wordless understanding. Lily Rose arrived in 1999, Jack in 2002, and fatherhood softened a soul long accustomed to drifting. He would later reflect that his children gave him a ground that finally felt trustworthy beneath my feet, like a sailor feeling land after years of open sea. Friends saw a gentler, more anchored man, painting in quiet afternoons, playing guitar in the garden, telling stories by candlelight. For 14 years, he and Vanessa quietly defied Hollywood's cynicism, unmarried yet more bound than many who were. Then time, the most patient and merciless sculptor, began carving invisible fissures into that once solid foundation. As his career pulled him farther away, with months on set, endless travel, and creative exhaustion weighing heavily on him, their once synchronized rhythm slowly fell out of step. Vanessa remained the quiet center of their world, holding the household together with grace, raising their children with dignity, while Depp slipped back into the gravity of fame he had once fled. The distance between them widened like a hairline crack across glass, imperceptible, silent, until the day it shattered. In 2012, at 49, they parted quietly, without spectacle, without scandal, only a profound stillness that seemed louder than any argument. There is a remembered image, almost cinematic in its cruelty. A hallway lit only by late afternoon sun, a suitcase resting by the door, and a house that still smelled like family, yet already felt empty. He later admitted that the final years were uneven, weathered by things we couldn't outrun, yet insisted that their priority remained their children and mutual respect. Beneath his composed words lay a private unraveling few could see. He withdrew inward, returning to old sketches and familiar melodies as if searching for the version of himself that had existed before the house no longer felt like home. Vanessa, with her characteristic restraint, I observed that love does not vanish. It merely transforms into something we must learn to recognize. Lily Rose, then 13, moved between Paris and Los Angeles, while Jack stayed mostly with his mother. There were no vicious legal battles, no displays of pride over wealth. Their vast assets were divided with quiet civility. For them, the separation was never about money. It was about the absence of something irreplaceable. After Vanessa left, the world around Depp remained dazzling, but the man inside had shifted irrevocably. He would later confess that she had been his true north, and without that compass, direction felt fragile, uncertain, elusive. The laughter that once filled their home was replaced by cavernous hotel rooms, polished yet empty, and crowded film sets where he stood alone even among hundreds. And his children became the thin, luminous thread keeping him tethered to the life he had built with her. Proof that something sacred still endured. Their ending was not explosive, not theatrical. It was a slow drifting apart, two souls continuing in parallel while wishing each other peace. Yet losing something so pure left a wound deeper than any public controversy, a pain that did not scream, but lingered, seeped into his art, and darkened his performances. Those closest to him noticed the change. His roles grew heavier, his music more melancholic, each note carrying the echo of what had been lost. Vanessa Paradis had given him a taste of home, of family, of stillness in a storm. And when she stepped out of his life, She seemed to take with her the most unguarded part of the man who once believed he had outrun chaos. What remained was not bitterness, but a quiet mourning, the understanding that some losses reshape you without announcing themselves. And yet, beneath the light that still lived in Lily Rose's gaze and Jack's quiet strength, there lingered a colder truth. Some wounds never close. They only learn how to breathe. Rupture never arrives like thunder. It slid in like a razor of polar air beneath a bolted door, unseen, clinical, tireless, thinning the foundations of everything he trusted until the idea of refuge began to cave inward from its own breath. What had once been shelter slowly mutated into a hollow, acoustic chamber where every memory ricocheted back, colder, sharper, slightly distorted. When 14 years with Vanessa Paradis sealed shut behind him, Johnny Depp, already past 50, kept moving forward, unaware that the road before him was not merely dark, but already burning without flame. In 2009, on the set of The Rum Diary, he encountered Amber Heard, and the gravity between them had the seductive menace of something that erases escape routes. It did not roar, it inhaled. He would later murmur, "Then it was that kind of fire that persuades you it must matter more than your own survival." From a single spark, the bond expanded into passion, defiance, and a hope reckless enough to outpace its own premonitions. By February 2015, at 51, they stood as husband and wife beneath the blitz of flashbulbs, lifting glasses as if love could draft a fragile treaty between two spirits allergic to stillness. Yet behind the polished smiles, warmth began to harden into watchfulness, and gentleness sharpened into something taut and metallic. Within 15 months, the incandescent dream reduced itself to smoke, leaving rooms saturated with half-finished sentences, abandoned looks, and silences that carved deeper than any outburst. A quiet violence that seeped into walls, into curtains, into the very air they tried to breathe. In May 2016, the split went public when Amber Heard filed for divorce and sought a restraining order, alleging instability tied to behavior and substance use, while Depp denied the claims, insisting the story being broadcast was not the life he had lived. Once released, the narrative stopped being human. It became a mechanism, refined by headlines, multiplied by platforms, and sharpened by a crowd detached from the consequences of its own judgment. The coverage didn't follow him. It hunted him, reducing his name to fragments that moved faster than the truth. It wasn't drowning, he later said quietly. It was being buried alive in language. In 2017, a $7 million settlement arrived with a joint statement calling their relationship intensely passionate and sometimes volatile while rejecting false claims. And yet nothing could restore what had already vanished inside him. The mirror no longer showed an artist who once turned pain into art, only a man pre-sentenced by public opinion. In December 2018, a Washington Post op-ed framed Heard as a figure associated with domestic abuse, his name absent yet present in every line, leading Depp to file a $50 million defamation suit, arguing the words had dismantled his life and career. What followed felt less like a trial than a prolonged exposure under merciless light. Studios retreated, contracts dissolved, iconic roles, Jack Sparrow, Gellert Grindelwald, slipped away, while his private wounds became public spectacle. "I was erased before I could speak," he said, eyes hollowed by a fatigue no camera could soften. The climax arrived in 2022 in Fairfax, Virginia, less a courtroom than a theater of scrutiny, where millions watched to see whether a man once deemed untouchable could remain upright after being stripped so publicly. The jury found the op-ed defamatory, awarding Depp $10 million in compensatory damages and $5 million in punitive damages, later reduced. while Heard received $2 million on her countersuit. On paper, it read like triumph. In his body, it registered as endurance. "Truth does not raise its voice," he said almost inwardly. "It simply stays when everything else tries to flee. And that staying leaves scars no ovation can polish away." When the noise finally ebbed, he did not celebrate. He withdrew, not from defeat, but from sheer depletion. In hushed hotel rooms, he woke to mornings without itineraries and nights with nothing left to shield. At times, he sat alone, so guitar balanced across his knees, fingers hovering above the strings as if testing whether the world would still answer him. There were nights, he admitted, when silence felt kinder than my own reflection. He returned to the one language that had never cross-examined him: music. Beside Jeff Beck, he played not to be witnessed, but to breathe. "Music doesn't pass sentence," he said softly. "It keeps space open." Night after night, beneath dim stage lights, each chord carried both wreckage and resolve. The subdued defiance of a man who refused to vanish. The applause that followed was not for a pirate or an icon, but for a human being who remained standing after the inferno. Perhaps the quiet truth beneath his arc is this: fame can hoist a person toward the sky, but only fire reveals who still endures when the spotlight dies. The verdict returned Johnny Depp his name, not the years consumed, not the innocence lost, not the peace he once knew. Still, from the ashes, he began to build again. Because art, like the human spirit, can be scorched, buried, and fractured, yet it resists erasure to the very end. After years locked inside a merciless legal night that pressed on him like water over a sinking body, Johnny Depp learned what it felt like to be displayed rather than seen, examined rather than believed in, each dawn arriving not as relief, but as another weight laid across his chest. Court corridors did not roar, yet they gnawed. The fluorescent lights did not blaze, yet they stripped him bare. And every headline, though it never touched his skin, left a burn deep beneath it. By 2022 at 59, when he murmured, "I stand here quieter than I entered, carrying a life that has been returned but permanently altered," there was no triumph in his voice, only the shuddering breath of a man breaking the surface after too long beneath it. The 6 years before that did not pass. They corroded him, stretching into sleepless hours, as every movement crucified beneath white lights and eyes that had already delivered their verdict. What the world consumed as entertainment, he endured as slow internal disassembly. The noise can hollow you so thoroughly that even silence begins to feel like a threat, he later said, his words stripped of anger and heavy with fatigue. The artist once powered by defiance had not merely aged, he had been thinned to the core, his once feral eyes now bearing the glazed stillness of someone who stared too long into judgment and refused to blink. When cameras caught him sketching in the courtroom, it was not distraction, it was air itself, each line a rope pulling him back from disbelief and isolation, a quiet proof that he still occupied his own body. When the gavel fell, and it did not give him back what the years had stolen. It only straightened a man who had long forgotten how to stand. For the first time in years, he exhaled without bracing for impact. Outside, voices detonated like thunder. Inside, the silence stretched vast, alien, and cutting. He understood then that vindication does not repair. It simply keeps you upright. "You don't walk away from a storm like that intact," he said later, almost to himself. "You just teach your lungs to keep working, while the sky is still tearing apart." In that endless rain, a harder kind of strength crystallized. The lines carved into his face no longer spoke of decay, but of a map. Every fall, every pause, every rise, etched into flesh. The man who once hunted applause drifted toward stillness, exchanging red carpets for dim rooms, spectacle for solitude, a noise for meaning. The world was no longer watching a star. It was witnessing a man dismantled in public who chose restraint over retaliation, presence over performance, survival over spectacle. In Johnny Depp's life, love did not build walls. It tore them down, leaving him exposed to every storm that followed. Yet beneath the hysteria and theater, one truth remained. He had been fractured, but not erased. The gilded mask of stardom finally split, exposing something raw and faintly luminous beneath. A man stripped of vanity, scarred yet sincere, exhausted yet unbroken. "I don't think victory exists here," he admitted quietly. "You just stay on your feet long enough to recognize your own reflection again." These were not crafted lines. They were words scarred into him by survival. He did not defeat the storm. He outlasted it. Then he transmuted pain into art, silence into sound. The legend trembled, but the man, altered, bruised, unmistakably human, endured. And buried beneath his journey is the lesson he never announced, that wholeness is not the absence of fire, but the relentless decision, one made again and again, to stand up from the ashes it leaves behind. Today, at the age of 62, Johnny Depp lives a life that appears quieter, yet carries deeper layers of reckoning and rebuilding, and his wealth now reads less like a trophy than a record of survival. His net worth is estimated at around $150 million, a stark contrast to the roughly $650 million he earned at his peak between 1999 and 2016, when global blockbusters and back-end deals made him one of Hollywood's most powerful stars. That fortune once fueled a lifestyle costing nearly $2 million a month, multiple staffs, constant private flights, vast art and memorabilia, and a taste for grandeur that matched his myth. Today, what remains is a leaner, more intentional portfolio shaped by legal battles and public scrutiny, anchored in real estate, royalties, selective film work, music, and painting. I'm suggesting a man who now values control and stability over spectacle. His properties quietly map his inner world. In Somerset, England, his 850-acre estate serves as sanctuary, rolling meadows, woodland, a private lake, and restored historic buildings, into which he invested about $5 million. The main house blends Old English stone with bohemian warmth, deep fireplaces, worn Persian rugs, shelves of books and guitars, and a sunlit conservatory overlooking wild gardens where he walks at dawn. In Plan de la Tour, his cluster of stone homes and courtyards still carries the memory of family life. His Little Hall's Pond Cay Island in the Bahamas, bought for $3.6 million, remains his most private refuge, with 5 beaches and modest villas designed to disappear into nature. In Los Angeles, his Hollywood Hills compound of 5 linked homes, worth about $19 million, retains a Gothic cinematic character, while his 5 penthouses in the Eastern Columbia Building House, a dedicated art studio where he paints late into the night. Beyond property, he still owns iconic vehicles, such as a 1959 Chevrolet Corvette, a Rolls-Royce Wraith, and a Range Rover, along with several restored vintage muscle cars, plus an $18 million yacht that has sailed the Mediterranean and Caribbean. Yet his daily rhythm is gentler now. He divides time between England and Europe, painting, writing music, playing guitar with close friends, and walking long hours across his land. His health has become a priority after years of strain. He has undergone major dental restoration and favors swimming and long walks over punishing workouts, carrying a seasoned, refined rock and roll look that feels lived in rather than staged. His bond with his children remains his most grounded anchor. With Lily Rose Depp, he shares quiet pride and mentorship, supporting her independence while staying present behind the scenes. His relationship with son Jack is more private but deeply affectionate, shaped by years away from cameras. His legacy is already forming through art, music, and philanthropy, including $1 million directed to charities after his settlement and about $800,000 raised via his Never Fear Truth NFT project for causes such as the Los Angeles Children's Hospital. Professionally, he is cautiously re-emerging with John Depp. His directorial film Modi 3 Days on the Wings of Madness and Ebenezer, A Christmas Carol, while whispers of a possible pirate's return linger. His journey bends from dazzling ascent into public crucible, from excess toward introspection, from noise into deliberate silence. Today, that evolution continues not through spectacle, but through choice, returning to cinema with Jean Dubarry, stepping behind the camera for Modi. 3 days on the wing of madness, and preparing for darker character-driven work ahead, including Day Drinker and Ebenezer, A Christmas Carol. But this is not a scramble back into the spotlight, but a controlled return on his own terms. Away from constant scrutiny, his life now asks a quieter question than success ever did. What do we truly chase? Applause, accumulation, or authenticity? What survives when the lights dim, and what remains when the crowd moves on? His days are measured less by premieres than by process, less by headlines than by ownership of his time, his body, his voice. Endurance here is not loud. It is the discipline of choosing when to speak and when to remain silent. If his journey resonates, leave a comment and share what it awakens in you. Which moment of his life stayed with you longest, and what it reveals to you about fame, resilience, and the courage to begin again. Not every victory announces itself. Like sometimes the bravest act is simply continuing, still curious, still creating, still standing, after the world has already decided who it thinks you are.